A lonely businessman visits his wife's grave every Sunday, carrying the weight of a past he can't fix. Until one day, three mysterious girls show up and reveal something devastating. She was our mom. Shocked, he discovers that the woman he loved died trying to tell him about the daughters he never knew existed. If you love a good story, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're from. Here we go. Richard Blackwood stood before the polished granite headstone, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the manicured cemetery grounds. The Boston morning air carried a hint of approaching autumn, but he barely noticed the chill. Every Sunday for the past 3 years, rain or shine, he had maintained this ritual, bringing fresh lilies to Elizabeth's grave, standing in silent contemplation for hours. The vast Brookside cemetery remained quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Richard preferred it this way. Here, away from the glass towers of Blackwood Enterprises where he commanded a financial empire, he could drop the mask of the cold, calculating CEO. Here, he could be the husband who never said enough when it mattered. "I closed the Westridge merger," he whispered to the stone, "the one you always said would be impossible." His voice, normally confident in boardrooms, wavered slightly. Stock jumped 12 points. He paused, listening to the silence that always answered him, wondering, as he did every Sunday, what Elizabeth would say if she could respond. Would she care about mergers and acquisitions? Or would she remind him, as she often did during their marriage, that numbers on spreadsheets couldn't keep anyone warm at night? Richard checked his watch, an old habit from a life measured in 15-minute billable increments. He'd been standing there for 2 hours already. His driver, Jenkins, would be waiting patiently in the black Bentley at the cemetery gates, never questioning these extended visits. As he prepared to leave, movement caught his eye, 3 small figures approaching from the eastern path. Children were unusual in this section of the cemetery, especially unaccompanied ones. 3 girls identical in appearance with copper-red hair that caught the sunlight. They wore mismatched clothes that had seen better days, but moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on him. Richard found himself frozen in place as they drew closer. They appeared to be around 8 years old, triplets clearly, with the same heart-shaped face, the same spattering of freckles across their noses. Something about them struck him as eerily familiar, though he was certain he'd never seen them before. "Are you lost?" he asked, his businesslike tone returning instinctively. The girl stopped a few feet away. The one in the center, distinguishable only by a faded blue ribbon holding back her hair, stepped forward. Her gaze dropped to the headstone, then back to Richard's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "She was our mother," she said simply. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He stepped backward, nearly stumbling over the small stone bench behind him. "That's impossible," he managed, his mind racing through calculations. Elizabeth had been gone for 3 years. These children appeared to be much older than that. Elizabeth wasn't, she couldn't have. "We've been looking for you," said the second girl, her voice slightly harsher than her sister's. "We found her letters." "What letters?" Richard's throat felt suddenly dry. "Who are you?" The third girl, who hadn't spoken, reached into a worn backpack and extracted a folded paper. She extended it toward him without a word, her eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, he realized with a shock, never leaving his face. Richard took the paper with trembling fingers. It was a birth certificate. 3 names were listed: Madison, Mackenzie, and Morgan Blackwood. Mother: Elizabeth Blackwood. Father: Richard Blackwood. "This is some kind of mistake," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he was seeing Elizabeth in their features, the slight upturn of their noses, the shape of their eyes. "We were born at Hope Haven," said the first girl. "Madison, according to the certificate. Mom tried to call you. She tried for months." Richard's mind flashed to the final year of Elizabeth's life, when their marriage had begun falling apart. They'd separated temporarily, his idea to focus on the Westridge deal, but had been talking about reconciliation. Then came the accident. On that rainy April night, and everything changed. "Where have you been all this time?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Everywhere," said Mackenzie, the more defiant one. "Foster homes, mostly. We ran away from the last one. They were going to split us up." Richard's world was tilting on its axis. 3 daughters. Elizabeth had been pregnant. How could he not have known? "Come with me," he said suddenly, making a decision. "We need to sort this out." The girls exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "How do we know we can trust you?" asked Mackenzie. "You found me," Richard replied. "That must mean something." 20 minutes later, they were seated in his Beacon Hill mansion, the girls perched uncomfortably on the edge of an immaculate white sofa that had never held children before. Richard had called his lawyer, Alan Prescott, who arrived with remarkable speed given the Sunday morning hour. "I need everything verified," Richard explained, in hushed tones as they stood in the kitchen, "and I need to understand how this happened." Alan nodded, his expression grave. "I'll put my best investigator on it immediately. Birth records, DNA if necessary, the works." When they returned to the living room, Morgan, the quietest of the 3, was examining a photograph on the mantelpiece, Elizabeth on their wedding day, her smile radiant against the backdrop of the Boston harbor. "She looks happy there," Morgan said softly. "She was," Richard replied, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. "We both were." Madison spoke up. "We have her letters. She wrote to you every week after we were born." "I never received any letters," Richard said, confusion clouding his features. "Someone must have," Mackenzie countered. "She wouldn't lie about that." The tension in the room was broken by Jenkins, who appeared with a tray of hot chocolate and cookies. The girls eyed the offering warily before Madison reached for a mug. "Where are you staying now?" Richard asked. "Nowhere," Mackenzie answered bluntly. "We've been sleeping in the back room of the library for the last week. The night guard lets us in." Richard exchanged glances with Alan. The lawyer nodded slightly, a silent confirmation that this situation required immediate action regardless of verification. "You'll stay here tonight," Richard decided, "until we figure things out." "We're not staying if we don't feel safe," Mackenzie declared, straightening her shoulders. "One night, then we decide." Richard, accustomed to dictating terms rather than negotiating them, found himself nodding in agreement. One night. Fair enough. That evening, after Alan had left with promises of swift action, Richard found himself standing in the doorway of a guest room, watching as 3 little girls who might be his daughters settled into a space larger than any they'd likely known. His housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, had scrambled to prepare accommodations, her surprise at the situation evident in her raised eyebrows, but professional enough not to question him directly. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted aloud when Mrs. Reynolds joined him in the hallway. "Nobody does at first, Mr. Blackwood," she replied with unexpected gentleness, "especially not overnight." As darkness fell over the Beacon Hill mansion, Richard sat alone in his study. The birth certificate spread before him, trying to reconstruct the timeline of events. If these girls were truly his daughters, they would have been conceived shortly before the separation. Elizabeth would have discovered her pregnancy afterward, while they were apart. But why wouldn't she have told him? And if she had tried, as the girls claimed, why hadn't he known? The answer came in a memory: his former executive assistant, Vanessa Green, handling his calls during the Westridge negotiations, screening everything, protecting his focus with ruthless efficiency. Had she intercepted messages from Elizabeth? The thought made his stomach turn. Outside the study window, the Boston skyline glittered with lights, the same view he'd contemplated for years without really seeing it. Now, everything looked different. Every certainty in his carefully constructed life had been upended in a single day. Tomorrow he would begin unraveling the mystery. Tonight, 3 little girls with Elizabeth's eyes were sleeping under his roof, and nothing would ever be the same again. Richard woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the sound of muffled voices coming from downstairs. For a fleeting second, he thought perhaps the previous day had been a dream, but the reality came rushing back as he recognized the high-pitched tones of children. His children. Possibly. He dressed quickly, choosing casual clothes instead of his usual tailored suit, a concession to the unusual circumstances. When he descended the grand staircase, he found Mrs. Reynolds in the kitchen, looking both flustered and amused as she attempted to prepare breakfast with 3 eager helpers. "Mr. Blackwood," she said with evident relief when she spotted him. The young ladies were hungry. Madison was carefully arranging strawberries on plates. Mackenzie was messily measuring pancake batter, while Morgan sat quietly at the counter, observing everything with those thoughtful eyes that reminded him so painfully of Elizabeth. "We always make breakfast together," Madison explained, not looking up from her task. "At every home. It's the only way to make sure everyone gets the same amount," Mackenzie added, with a matter-of-factness that spoke volumes about their experiences. Richard approached, cautiously, feeling like an intruder in his own kitchen. "Can I help?" The girls exchanged their silent communication again before Madison nodded. "You can flip the pancakes, but don't make them too brown." For the next 30 minutes, Richard Blackwood, whose culinary expertise had previously extended only to ordering from 5-star restaurants, found himself learning to flip pancakes under the critical gaze of an 8-year-old. The domesticity of it was entirely foreign to him, yet something about it felt oddly right. Breakfast was a tentative affair, punctuated by careful questions and cautious answers. Richard learned that Madison was the peacemaker, always finding middle ground. Mackenzie was the protector, fierce and suspicious of everyone's motives. Morgan, though quietest, noticed everything. She was the memory keeper, the one who remembered addresses, phone numbers, and the exact wording of promises made and broken. The doorbell interrupted their meal. Alan had arrived, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Diana Reeves, a private investigator specializing in family matters. "We should speak privately," Alan suggested, eyeing the girls. Mrs. Reynolds offered to show the triplets the garden, but Mackenzie folded her arms stubbornly. "If it's about us, we want to hear it," she insisted. Richard considered the determined expressions on their small faces and made another uncharacteristic decision. They stay. They've earned that much. In his study, Diana spread out a preliminary report. "I worked through the night," she explained. "What I've found so far confirms their story. Elizabeth Blackwood was admitted to Hope Haven Women's Shelter on October 12th, 3 years ago. She gave birth to triplet girls on February 3rd. Richard's mind reeled. October, just weeks after their separation began. The intake forms indicate she attempted to contact her husband repeatedly, but was unsuccessful. Diana continued. The girls were placed in foster care after her. She glanced at the children and adjusted her wording. After she was gone, they've been in 4 different homes since then. "Why didn't anyone contact me?" Richard demanded. "According to records, efforts were made," Diana replied, "but the contact information Elizabeth provided led nowhere. It seems letters were returned unopened." "My office," Richard realized aloud. "They would have gone to my office during the Westridge negotiations, when I was working around the clock." Alan nodded grimly. "I've already requested access to all mail logs and phone records from that period." "There's more," Diana said quietly. "Elizabeth was attempting to reach you on the day of the accident. The shelter counselor confirmed she was going to your office, determined to speak with you directly." The implication hit Richard like a physical blow. Elizabeth had been on her way to him when the accident happened. If he had known, if he had answered her calls. Morgan slipped from her chair and approached the desk, pulling something from her pocket, a faded Polaroid photograph. It showed Elizabeth, her pregnancy evident, surrounded by 3 newborn infants in hospital blankets. "She kept this with her letters," Morgan said softly, placing it on the desk. Richard stared at the image, unable to speak. Elizabeth's face showed exhaustion, but also a fierce protective love as she gazed at the tiny bundles around her. "We need DNA confirmation," Alan said gently, "for legal purposes." "Of course," Richard replied automatically, though looking at the photograph and then at the 3 faces watching him, he already knew the truth. These were Elizabeth's daughters, and his. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Alan left to expedite the DNA testing, and begin the legal process for temporary custody. Mrs. Reynolds took the girls shopping for necessities. They had arrived with only backpacks containing a few precious items, Elizabeth's letters, some worn clothing, and a single stuffed animal they apparently shared. Alone in his study, Richard finally allowed himself to confront the magnitude of what had happened. He had not only lost his wife 3 years ago, he had lost the chance to know she was carrying his children. Someone had deliberately kept that information from him. His suspicions crystallized when Alan called that afternoon. "I've been through the mail logs," his lawyer reported. "Every letter from Hope Haven was signed for by Vanessa Green, your executive assistant at the time. Phone records show 17 calls from Elizabeth's number during that period. All were logged by Ms. Green as telemarketer or wrong number." Richard's hand tightened around the phone. "Find her." "Already on it," Alan assured him. "She left Blackwood Enterprises 2 years ago. Last known employment was with Riverton Financial in Chicago." When Richard hung up, he found Morgan standing in the doorway of his study, watching him with those perceptive eyes. "You didn't know about us," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Richard admitted. "If I had known—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence. Would he have abandoned the Westridge deal? Changed his priorities? He liked to think so, but the truth was, the man he had been 3 years ago might not have made the right choice. "Mum said you were always working," Morgan continued, "but she said you were building something important." Richard swallowed hard. "Nothing was more important than her, than you three. I just didn't realize it then." Later that evening, when Madison and Mackenzie had fallen asleep in the guest room, exhausted from the emotional day, Morgan approached Richard with a battered shoebox. "These are her letters," she said simply. "You should read them." Richard accepted the box with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all addressed to him at Blackwood Enterprises, all marked "Return to Sender," in handwriting he now recognized as Vanessa's. He began reading, starting with the earliest dated letter. "Richard, I don't know how to tell you this, especially with things so strained between us. I'm pregnant. The doctor says it's triplets. I'm scared, but also somehow happy. Maybe this is a chance for us to remember what matters." Letter after letter chronicled Elizabeth's journey, her hope that he would respond, her gradual acceptance that he wouldn't, her determination to create a life for their daughters despite his absence. The final letter, dated just days before the accident, broke him. "I've decided to come see you in person. Maybe face to face you'll listen. Maybe you'll want to meet your daughters. They're beautiful, Richard. They have your stubbornness and my eyes. I'm terrified of seeing you again, but I have to try for them." Richard read until dawn, tears flowing freely down his face. When the first light of morning touched the Boston skyline, he made himself a promise. He would be the father these girls deserved, not the husband he had failed to be. The DNA results arrived faster than expected, expedited by Alan's connections and Richard's willingness to pay any price for speed. The confirmation was merely a formality, 99.99% probability of paternity for all 3 girls. "What happens now?" Madison asked when Richard gathered them to share the news. "Now," Richard said carefully, "I'd like you to stay with me permanently if that's what you want." "What about school?" Morgan asked practically. "I've researched some options," Richard replied. "There's Cambridge Academy. They have an excellent support program for children who've experienced—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Children who need extra care." Mackenzie's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You want to send us to some fancy school to make us like you?" "No," Richard answered honestly. "I want to send you to a school that can help you heal, that can give you opportunities." "What if we don't like it?" Mackenzie challenged. Richard considered this. "Then we'll find somewhere else. This is your home now if you want it to be. We'll figure it out together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, unfamiliar territory for all 4 Blackwoods. "One step at a time," Madison suggested, always the mediator. Richard nodded, feeling a strange new emotion welling up inside him. It took a moment to recognize it as hope, something he hadn't experienced since Elizabeth's final day. That night, as he checked on the girls before bed, he found them huddled together on one bed despite having separate rooms prepared. They slept curled toward each other, a protective formation developed through years of uncertainty. Richard understood then that earning their trust would take more than DNA tests and promises. It would take presence, something he had failed to give Elizabeth, something he was determined to give their daughters, no matter what it cost. The transition from solitary businessman to father of triplets transformed Richard's meticulously ordered world into beautiful chaos. 2 weeks after the girls' arrival, his Beacon Hill mansion bore little resemblance to the pristine showcase it had once been. Colorful backpacks cluttered the entryway. Schoolbooks and art supplies occupied the dining table. 3 identical pairs of sneakers, in different states of tidiness, lined the hallway. Richard navigated this new landscape with determination, if not grace. Each morning brought a fresh challenge. Learning to style hair, Madison patiently, teaching him how to create passable braids, mediating disputes over bathroom time, and discovering that the breakfast preferences established on day 1 were entirely different by day 5. Cambridge Academy had accepted the girls mid-semester, offering specialized support and understanding for their unique situation. The school counselor, Dr. Abrams, had been clear with Richard. These children have experienced significant trauma and displacement. Stability must be your priority. Richard took this advice to heart, rearranging his schedule. To personally drive them to school each morning, the boardroom could wait. Watching his daughters walk into their classrooms couldn't. His executive team wasn't pleased. Marcus Fletcher, Blackwood Enterprises' ambitious COO, had begun sending increasingly urgent emails about Richard's absence from key meetings. The Westridge acquisition was complete, but integration issues demanded attention. Richard found himself responding with unprecedented brevity. Handle it. On this particular morning, the girls were finishing breakfast when Richard's phone buzzed. With Marcus's name again, he silenced it without answering. "Is your work mad at you?" Morgan asked, observing him with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "They'll manage," Richard replied, helping her pack lunch into a new butterfly-printed lunchbox. "Mom's letters said you never missed work," Madison commented. "She said you even took calls on Christmas." Richard winced at the accuracy of this assessment. "I was different then." "Why?" Mackenzie challenged, her tone carrying the edge it always did when Elizabeth was mentioned. Before Richard could formulate a response, his phone buzzed again. Alan this time, which he couldn't ignore. "I've located Vanessa Green," his lawyer reported without preamble. "She's working as an executive assistant at Riverton Financial in Chicago. Do you want me to approach her?" Richard glanced at the 3 expectant faces watching him. "No, I'll handle this personally. Book me on a flight tomorrow." After hanging up, he explained to the girls that he needed to make a brief business trip. "Mrs. Reynolds will stay with you and I'll be back the next day." "You're leaving us?" Mackenzie's voice rose with alarm, her fork clattering against her plate. "Just overnight," Richard assured her. "I need to speak with someone important." "Important?" "Like work?" Mackenzie pushed. "Or important like us?" Richard recognized the fear beneath her hostility, the fear of abandonment that all 3 carried. "Important for our family," he said carefully. "I need to understand what happened with your mother's messages." This seemed to satisfy Madison and Morgan, but Mackenzie remained skeptical. "You'll really come back tomorrow? Not next week?" "I promise," Richard said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'll be home for dinner." The flight to Chicago gave Richard time to examine the complex emotions churning inside him. Anger at Vanessa's betrayal mixed with guilt over his own role in creating an environment where such betrayal was possible. Had he been so obsessed with work that his assistant believed she was protecting him by hiding his wife's desperate attempts to reach him? Vanessa's office at Riverton Financial occupied the 23rd floor of a sleek downtown tower when Richard stepped off the elevator. Her surprise at seeing him was evident. "Mr. Blackwood," she stammered, rising from her desk. "I wasn't expecting... How did you find me?" "We need to talk," Richard said evenly. "Privately." In a small conference room with Chicago's skyline stretching beyond the windows, Richard placed a folder on the table between them. It contained copies of Elizabeth's returned letters and phone logs. "I know what you did," he said simply. Vanessa's face paled as she glanced at the evidence. "I was protecting the company, the Westridge deal." "You were hiding my pregnant wife's attempts to contact me," Richard interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "You intercepted personal communications. You kept me from knowing I had daughters. You were so close to closing the biggest deal in the company's history," Vanessa defended, though her voice wavered. "Elizabeth was always emotional, always making demands on your time. The board was watching your every move. One distraction and billions would have been lost." "My wife is gone," Richard said, the words burning in his throat. "She died trying to reach me, believing I was ignoring her. My daughter spent 3 years in foster care because of decisions you made." Vanessa's composure cracked. "I never meant for any of that to happen. I thought once the deal closed you could sort things out with her. I didn't know she was—" She broke off, unable to finish. "Pregnant with my children?" Richard supplied, coldly. "No, you didn't bother to find out what was so urgent. You just decided it couldn't possibly be more important than a merger." He stood gathering the documents. "I won't be pursuing legal action, not because you deserve mercy, but because my daughters have been through enough trauma without a public's scandal." Vanessa seemed to shrink under his gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I truly am." "So am I," Richard replied, "because I created the culture that made you think your actions were justified. That business should come before family. That's on me." Back in his hotel room, Richard found himself unable to sleep. The confrontation with Vanessa had provided answers but no relief. In the stillness of the night, he pulled out his phone and called the mansion. "Everything okay?" he asked when Mrs. Reynolds answered. "The girls are fine, Mr. Blackwood," she assured him, "though they made me check under the beds twice for monsters before they'd go to sleep." Can you put the phone by them, even though they're sleeping?" There was a pause, then the sound of movement. When Mrs. Reynolds spoke again, her voice was softer. "They're right here, sir." "I just wanted to say good night," Richard said, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. "Even if they can't hear me." After hanging up, he sat on the edge of the bed, Elizabeth's final letter in his hands. He had brought it with him as a reminder of what his priorities should be now. The paper was worn from multiple readings, the handwriting achingly familiar. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Richard took the earliest flight back to Boston, arriving at Cambridge Academy just as the dismissal bell rang. The girls spotted him from the school steps, their expressions shifting from surprise to relief. "You came back," Mackenzie said as they approached, trying to sound nonchalant despite the wonder in her voice. "I promised I would," Richard replied simply. That evening over dinner, Richard shared an edited version of his conversation with Vanessa. "She kept your mother's messages from me," he explained. "I never knew Elizabeth was trying to reach me." "Why would she do that?" Madison asked, her young face troubled by the adult complexity of the situation. "She thought work was more important than family," Richard answered honestly, "and I had given her reason to believe that." "Was it?" Morgan's quiet question cut through the room. "More important to you?" Richard set down his fork, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "It was then. I thought success meant building something that would last. I didn't understand that family is what truly lasts." Later that night, after bedtime stories and goodnight kisses that still felt new and precious, Richard found Mackenzie standing in the doorway of his study, her small figure silhouetted against the hallway light. "I had a bad dream," she admitted, vulnerability replacing her usual defiance. Richard patted the space beside him on the sofa. "Want to tell me about it?" She climbed up, keeping a careful distance between them. "I dreamed you didn't come back from Chicago, just like Mom didn't come back that day." The raw fear in her voice broke something open inside Richard. "Mackenzie, I will always come back to you. Always." "You can't promise that," she argued, practical even in her distress. "Nobody can." "You're right," Richard conceded. "But I can promise to try my hardest. to put you three first, every single day. Mackenzie studied him carefully, searching for insincerity. Finding none, she inched closer. Mom used to sing when we had bad dreams. I'm not much of a singer, Richard admitted. That's okay, Mackenzie said, surprising him by leaning against his side. You can just stay until I fall asleep. As his daughter's breathing gradually slowed beside him, Richard realized what Dr. Abrams had meant about stability. It wasn't just about consistent routines or staying in one place. It was about being present, truly present, in moments both significant and small. The following week brought the first real test of Richard's new priorities. Cambridge Academy called midday. Mackenzie had gotten into a fight with another student who had made a comment about not having a real family. Richard was in the middle of a critical board meeting when the call came through. Without hesitation, he stood. Gentlemen, we'll need to continue this tomorrow. Marcus Fletcher's incredulous voice followed him. Richard, the Tokyo investors are waiting for our decision. They can wait another day, Richard replied, already heading for the door. My daughter needs me now. He found Mackenzie in the principal's office, knuckles bruised, eyes defiant but rimmed with tears. She refused to shed. He said we were just charity cases, she explained in the car. That you only took us in because you felt guilty. Richard gripped the steering wheel, anger flaring on her behalf. Is that what you believe? Mackenzie stared out the window. Sometimes, when you look sad, watching us. The honesty stunned him. If I look sad, it's not because you're here. It's because I missed so much time with you already. Because your mother isn't here to see you grow up. They sat in the parked car. Outside their home, the engine silent. I don't remember her very well anymore, Mackenzie confessed in a small voice. Just bits and pieces. Is that bad? No, Richard assured her gently. We'll remember for you all the important parts. That evening, Richard cancelled his remaining meetings for the week. Instead, he gathered the girls in the rarely used living room and pulled out boxes of photographs. Elizabeth through the years, from college sweetheart to confident professional, to beloved wife. Tell us everything, Madison requested, curling up beside him on the floor. So Richard did, sharing stories of their mother's laugh, her passion for obscure documentaries, her inability to cook anything without setting off the smoke alarm. With each memory, the girls seemed to relax, as if pieces of themselves were being returned. Morgan, ever the observer, noticed a pattern in the photos. You're always looking at her, she pointed out, even when the camera is facing you. Richard hadn't realized this himself until that moment. In every image, his gaze was fixed on Elizabeth, even as she smiled for the photographer. I loved watching her, he admitted. She made every room brighter just by being in it. Like Madison does, Morgan said thoughtfully. Like all three of you do, Richard corrected, feeling a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. That night, for the first time, Mackenzie asked if she could sleep in his room. Just for tonight, she insisted, maintaining her independence. Richard made a pallet on the floor beside his bed, expecting her to take it. Instead, Mackenzie climbed directly onto the massive king-sized bed. You can have the floor, she informed, him with restored confidence. Richard laughed, actually laughed, a sound the mansion hadn't heard in years, and took the pallet without complaint. As he drifted toward sleep, he heard Mackenzie's small voice in the darkness. Dad? The word used for the first time caught him by surprise. Yes? I'm glad you're our dad, she whispered, even if you're still learning how. So am I, Richard replied, his heart full, and I am learning every day. The Boston autumn painted the public garden in fiery hues as Richard and the girls established their Sunday ritual, a walk through the park, followed by lunch at the small Italian restaurant Elizabeth had loved. 6 weeks had passed since the cemetery meeting that changed everything, and routines were slowly forming, creating the framework of family life. Today, however, those routines were interrupted by an unexpected phone call from Alan. The Department of Children and Family Services wants to evaluate the placement, his lawyer explained. Standard procedure when a previously unknown parent takes custody, but we need to be prepared. Richard glanced at the girls who were feeding ducks by the pond's edge, their identical copper heads bent together in conversation. "What do we need to do?" he asked, keeping his voice even despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "They'll send a caseworker to assess the home environment, interview you and the girls, review your background." Alan paused. "Given your high profile and the unusual circumstances, they're being particularly thorough. Meaning? Meaning they've assigned Judith Parker to the case. She's stringent in her assessments." The evaluator arrived the following Tuesday, a stern-faced woman with clipboard in hand and skepticism in every line of her body. Ms. Parker moved through the mansion with calculating eyes, noting the recently added safety locks on cabinets, the homework station set up in the sunny breakfast nook, the photographs of Elizabeth now prominently displayed throughout the home. "This is all very new for you, Mr. Blackwood," she observed as they sat in his study. "3 children require significant attention and emotional resources. Your background suggests limited experience in both areas." Richard matched her directness. "I'm learning every day." "Learning parenthood with traumatized children is like learning to swim in a hurricane," Miss Parker replied. "These girls have suffered loss, abandonment, and instability. They need more than financial security and good intentions." "I'm aware of that," Richard said, maintaining his composure though her words struck nerves. "They're in therapy. I'm in therapy. We're working through this together." Ms. Parker made a notation. "Your company requires considerable time and energy. How are you balancing those demands with parenting?" "I've delegated most of my daily responsibilities. I'm working primarily from home and attending only essential meetings." "And how has that affected Blackwood Enterprises?" Richard's jaw tightened. "The company will adapt. Even if it impacts the bottom line, your board members and shareholders might have concerns." "Let them," Richard replied, with sudden steel in his voice. "My daughters come first now." Miss Parker's expression remained impassive as she moved to her next question. "I'd like to speak with the girls individually." Richard agreed, though anxiety churned within him as the caseworker disappeared into the living room where the triplets were reading. What would they say? Would they feel secure enough to call this home? Did they want to stay with him? While he waited, Richard found himself drawn to Elizabeth's diary, which Morgan had presented to him just days earlier, another piece of their mother she'd kept safe. He hadn't had the courage to read it yet, afraid of facing the full extent of his failure as a husband. Now, he opened it to a random page dated shortly after their separation. Richard called today about the house insurance of all things. So formal, so distant. I wonder if he can sense the changes in me already, though the pregnancy barely shows. I should have told him immediately, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps. Fear that even this miracle wouldn't be enough to make him truly see me again. When did we become strangers who once loved each other? Richard closed the diary, a familiar ache spreading through his chest. Elizabeth had doubted his capacity to prioritize family even then. Had he given her reason, or was it her insecurity speaking? The question haunted him as Ms. Parker returned, her expression giving nothing away. "Your daughters are remarkably resilient," she noted, "and protective of each other." "They've had to be," Richard acknowledged. "Mackenzie expressed concerns about your work eventually taking priority again. She said, and I quote, 'Adults always choose the important stuff over kids.'" The words stung because Richard recognized their source, his own patterns, observed by Elizabeth and now feared by their daughters. "Madison believes you're trying your best, though she worries you'll get tired of all the kid stuff," Ms. Parker continued. "Morgan was less forthcoming, but she did say you read to them every night, even when you're tired." Richard smiled slightly at this. Reading bedtime stories had become his favorite ritual, even when the girls selected books clearly intended for much younger children, testing whether he'd find the task beneath him. "I'll be submitting my initial report next week," Ms. Parker concluded. "In the meantime, I strongly recommend continuing the family therapy sessions. These children have experienced significant disruption. Stability must be your priority." After she left, Richard found the girls huddled in Madison's room, clearly waiting for his reaction. "Did we say the right things?" Madison asked anxiously. "You said the truth," Richard reassured her. "That's always right." Mackenzie eyed him warily. "She asked if we wanted to stay with you forever, if we felt safe." Richard held his breath. "And what did you say?" "I said, we're still deciding," Mackenzie answered with characteristic bluntness. "Madison said yes right away because she always sees the good in people." Morgan just nodded. "That seems fair," Richard acknowledged, hiding the hurt her words caused. "This is still new for all of us." Later that night, unable to sleep, Richard returned to Elizabeth's diary. He read entry after entry chronicling her pregnancy, her hopes for the daughters growing within her, her attempts to reach him, her gradual acceptance that she might need to raise them alone. One passage particularly gutted him. "The shelter counselor asked today if I had family to help with the babies. I said no, my parents are gone, and Richard has chosen a different path. I don't blame him anymore. We wanted different things in the end. He wanted empire, I wanted home. The girls kick so strongly now. I tell them stories about their father, the good parts, the man I fell in love with, the one who brought me wildflowers on ordinary Tuesdays, who knew all the constellations, who had so much love to give before ambition consumed him. That's the father I want them to know, even if he never knows them." Richard closed the book, tears streaming unchecked down his face. He had been that man once, capable of spontaneous affection, of presence, of prioritizing love over achievement. When had he lost his way? And could he find his way back, not just for the girls' sake, but for his own? Morning brought fresh challenges. The DNA results had been leaked to the press, likely by someone at the testing facility, and reporters gathered outside the mansion gates. Headlines screamed about the Blackwood heirs and CEO's secret family. Richard's phone erupted with calls from board members demanding explanations. Marcus Fletcher was particularly insistent. "The stock is fluctuating wildly. Investors are concerned about your focus and judgment. We need you to make a statement immediately." Instead, Richard called the school to warn them about possible media presence, then gathered the girls in the secure courtyard garden where they couldn't be photographed. "Some people are going to be very interested in our family," he explained carefully. "They might say things that aren't true or ask questions that feel uncomfortable." Madison looked worried. "Why do they care about us?" "Because I'm known in the business world," Richard said. "And because people are curious about unexpected stories." "Like how you didn't know about us," Morgan clarified. "Exactly." Mackenzie kicked at a stone. "So we're just a story to them?" "To them, yes," Richard acknowledged. "But not to me. Never to me." The media frenzy intensified when school officials called that afternoon. A reporter had attempted to approach the girls during recess, prompting an immediate lockdown. Richard arrived to find all three huddled in the counselor's office, visibly shaken. "I want to go home," Madison whispered, clinging to his hand, the first time any of them had initiated physical contact with him. Mackenzie, however, was furious. "This is your fault. If you weren't rich and important, nobody would care about us." "You're right," Richard admitted, kneeling to her level. "And I'm sorry you're caught in this storm that isn't your doing." "Can we go back to the shelter?" Morgan asked quietly. "Nobody bothered us there." The question broke Richard's heart. "Would you really feel safer there than with me?" The girls exchanged their silent communication before Madison spoke. "We want to stay with you, but not with all those people watching us." That evening, after consulting with Alan, Richard made a decision. He called a trusted reporter from the Boston Globe and invited her to the house. With the girls' permission, he gave a single interview, establishing boundaries while acknowledging the basic facts. Yes, he had daughters he hadn't known about. Yes, there had been a communication failure. No, further details would not be forthcoming, as the children's privacy was paramount. "My family is not a news story," he stated firmly. "It's my life now and my priority." The interview helped stem the most intrusive coverage, but the scrutiny continued to affect the girls. Morgan began having nightmares. Madison grew clingy, afraid to let Richard out of her sight. Mackenzie's anger intensified, directed primarily at the world, but occasionally at Richard himself. The breaking point came after a particularly difficult therapy session. where Mackenzie had shouted that she hated being a Blackwood and wished she'd never found her father. Richard had maintained his composure throughout, but driving home he noticed her unusually subdued demeanor. "I didn't mean it," she said suddenly, staring out the window. "About hating being yours." "I know," Richard assured her. "You're allowed to be angry, Mackenzie. The other kids at school keep asking questions. One boy wanted to take a picture with me for Instagram." Her voice wavered slightly. "Like I'm something special just because my dad is rich." Richard pulled the car over, turning to face her fully. "Listen to me. You are special because you're brave and fierce and protective, not because of my name or my company." Mackenzie blinked rapidly. "Mom said you were important, that you were building something that mattered." "I thought I was," Richard replied honestly, "but I was wrong about what truly matters." That night, after the girls were asleep, Richard made another life-altering decision. He called Marcus Fletcher. "I'm stepping down as CEO," he announced without preamble. Marcus's shock was audible. "Because of the media attention? It'll blow over, Richard. We just need to manage it carefully." "Because my daughters need me more than the company does," Richard corrected. "I'll remain on the board, but the day-to-day operations need someone fully committed." "You've built this company from nothing," Marcus protested. "It's your legacy." Richard thought of the 3 sleeping girls upstairs, Elizabeth's eyes, his determination, wholly themselves in ways he was just beginning to appreciate. "No," he said softly. "They're my legacy now." The following morning, as he prepared to tell the girls about his decision, the doorbell rang. Ms. Parker stood on the threshold, her usual clipboard in hand. "I've reviewed your case thoroughly, Mr. Blackwood," she began, without greeting. "The circumstances are unusual, and there are legitimate concerns about your ability to provide the emotional stability these children need, given your professional obligations." Richard braced himself for her conclusion, but before she could continue, a small voice interrupted from behind him. "He reads the same book 3 times if we ask," Morgan said, suddenly appearing at his side. "Even the boring parts." Madison joined them, adding, "And he learned to do braids even though he's not very good at it." Miss Parker's expression softened slightly. "Children need more than books and braids." "He stays when we have bad dreams," Mackenzie declared, completing the trio as she moved to stand protectively in front of Richard. "He doesn't leave even when we kick in our sleep." Richard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, overwhelmed by this unexpected defense. "I've made my decision," Miss Parker announced, looking at the united front before her. "Temporary. Custody will continue with monthly evaluations. Permanent custody will be considered after 6 months of demonstrated stability." After she departed, Richard gathered the girls in the kitchen, where pancakes had become their Saturday tradition. "I have something important to tell you," he began, watching their faces grow serious. "I've decided to step back from running Blackwood Enterprises." Madison's eyes widened. "Because of us." "Because of my priorities," Richard clarified. "Because some things matter more than business success." Mackenzie studied him skeptically. "Won't you miss it? Being important?" Richard smiled at the echo of his former values in her question. "I'm still going to work, just differently, with more time for what truly matters." "Us?" Morgan asked quietly. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "You 3 are family." The word hung in the air between them, family, no longer a concept lost to the past or an aspiration for the future, but a present reality they were building together, day by day. Winter descended on Boston with surprising gentleness, wrapping the city in a pristine blanket of snow that transformed the Blackwood Mansion's severe architecture into something from a fairy tale. Inside, the transformation was equally dramatic. Holiday decorations filled spaces that had remained unadorned for years, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through previously silent halls. 4 months had passed since the Triplets had entered Richard's life. 4 months of stumbling through parenthood, of therapy sessions and school meetings, of nightmares and breakthrough moments. 4 months of becoming a family, one tentative step at a time. Richard stood in the doorway of the living room, watching as the girls helped Mrs. Reynolds decorate the massive Christmas tree that dominated the space. A tradition they had insisted upon starting the day after Thanksgiving. "Mom always said Christmas trees should be up as long as possible," Madison had explained, "because they're magic." Now, as Morgan carefully positioned a handmade ornament on a lower branch, Richard felt a bittersweet pang. This would be their first Christmas as a family, but also their first without Elizabeth. How many other firsts had she missed? How many would she continue to miss? Madison noticed him watching and waved him over. "You have to help. Mrs. Reynolds can't reach the top." Richard obliged, lifting the crystal star to the highest point of the tree. As he settled it in place, he caught Morgan studying him with that observant gaze. "Mom would like this," she said softly. "She told us once that you proposed to her under a Christmas tree." The memory rushed back with startling clarity. Elizabeth's face illuminated by twinkling lights, her surprised laugh when she realized he was actually kneeling, the way she had tackled him in joy before remembering to say yes. "That's right," Richard confirmed, amazed that Elizabeth had shared such details with their infant daughters. At Rockefeller Center in New York, there was a violinist playing nearby, and it started snowing right after she said yes. "Like in a movie," Mackenzie commented, but without her usual skepticism. "Better than any movie," Richard replied, cherishing the connection to Elizabeth these shared memories created. That evening, as Richard tucked the girls into their beds, they now had separate rooms, but still preferred to sleep near each other, Madison made an unexpected request. "Can we visit Mom for Christmas at the cemetery?" The question caught him off guard. They hadn't returned to Brookside since their first meeting. Richard had been hesitant to push the issue, unsure how the girls would feel revisiting the place where they had taken such a monumental step. "Of course," he agreed. "We can go whenever you want." On Christmas morning, Mackenzie decided, before presents, she should be part of it. The following day brought another milestone. The final custody evaluation before Ms. Parker would make her recommendation regarding permanent placement. Richard had prepared diligently, ensuring every aspect of their home life demonstrated the stability the girls needed. What he hadn't prepared for was the question Ms. Parker posed after her usual observations. The girls mentioned visiting their mother's grave for Christmas, she noted. "How are you helping them process their grief, Mr. Blackwood?" Richard hesitated. "We talk about Elizabeth often. I share memories, answer their questions." "But how are you processing your own grief?" Ms. Parker pressed. "Children take their emotional cues from adults. If you're suppressing your feelings about your wife, they'll learn to do the same with theirs." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Richard had been so focused on helping the girls heal that he'd neglected his own mourning, both for Elizabeth and for the years lost with his daughters. "I'm working on it," he admitted. "Miss." Parker nodded, making a note. "Grief work is family." "Work, Mr. Blackwood. It's not something to get past, it's something to move through together." That night, after the girls were asleep, Richard found himself drawn to Elizabeth's diary again. He'd been reading it slowly, allowing himself to absorb her words, her hopes, her disappointments. Tonight, he turned to entries from her time at Hope Haven. "The social worker asked today what I want for the girls if something happens to me. Such a terrible question for a pregnant woman, but practical. I told her I want them to stay together, always. I want them to know they're loved. I want them to find Richard someday when they're ready, when they need to understand where they came from. Not because he deserves them, he hasn't earned that yet, but because they deserve to know the good in him that I once knew so well." Richard closed the diary, his throat tight. Elizabeth had wanted the girls to find him even after everything. She had still believed there was good in him worth knowing. The next morning, Richard received unexpected news. The board had unanimously approved his reduced role and Marcus Fletcher's promotion to CEO. The transition would be announced after the New Year, allowing Richard to focus entirely on the upcoming holiday with his daughters. He shared the news with the girls over dinner. "So, you're not the boss anymore?" Mackenzie asked, trying to understand. "I'll still be involved, but not running the day-to-day operations," Richard explained. "Think of it like being a teacher who helps when needed, instead of being in charge of the whole classroom." Madison nodded thoughtfully. "That means you'll be home more?" That's the plan, Richard confirmed. Morgan, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Are you sad about it? Mom said the company was your favorite thing. The question revealed how Elizabeth had perceived him, and Richard couldn't deny the accuracy of it. It was once, he acknowledged, but priorities change. People change. Because of us? Madison asked, echoing a concern she'd expressed before. Because of me, Richard corrected gently. Because I'm learning what truly matters. As Christmas approached, the girls threw themselves into preparations with escalating excitement. Richard found himself swept along, amazed by how their enthusiasm transformed obligations into joys. Shopping for gifts became an adventure. Baking cookies, with considerable mess and questionable results, became an evening of laughter. Even wrapping presents, something he'd previously outsourced, became a meaningful ritual as they created handmade tags and bows. On Christmas Eve, after the traditional reading of The Night Before Christmas, with Madison insisting on the not, even a mouse line being read 3 times for emphasis, Richard found himself alone in his study. The house was quiet, the girls finally asleep after hours of anticipatory excitement. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey and raised it, in a silent toast to Elizabeth. You should be here, he whispered to the empty room. They're so beautiful, Liz, so much like you. The tears came then, not the controlled, private grief he'd allowed himself in measured doses, but raw, unrestricted mourning for all that had been lost. For Elizabeth, who would never see their daughters grow up. For the girls who would know their mother only through stories and photographs. For himself, who had wasted precious time on things that now seemed meaningless. He didn't hear the door open, didn't realize he wasn't alone until small arms wrapped around his shoulders from behind. It's okay, Dad, Madison whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Mom said grown-ups need to cry too sometimes. Richard turned to find not just Madison, but all 3 girls in their matching Christmas pajamas, watching him with solemn expressions. I'm sorry, he began, embarrassed to be caught in such vulnerability. Don't say sorry, Mackenzie interrupted, with surprising gentleness. That's what Dr. Abrams says. Feelings aren't things to be sorry for. Morgan stepped forward, offering a tissue from the box on his desk. We miss her too, she said simply. Something shifted in that moment. A barrier, between them dissolving, as Richard allowed his daughters to witness his grief rather than shielding them from it. They clambered onto the sofa beside him, Morgan curling against his side while Madison held his hand, and Mackenzie maintained a close but slightly separate position. Tell us a Christmas story about her, Madison requested. One we don't know yet. So Richard did. He told them about Elizabeth's passion for over-decorating, her tradition of wearing ridiculous holiday sweaters, her insistence that Santa needed homemade cookies, not store-bought. He shared the memory of their last Christmas together, how she had surprised him with tickets to a symphony performance he'd mentioned, wanting to see months earlier, proving she listened even when he thought she wasn't. She noticed everything, Richard concluded, every detail, every unspoken wish. Like Morgan does, Mackenzie observed, not for the first time drawing parallels between her sister and their mother. Exactly like that, Richard agreed, smiling at his quietest daughter. They fell asleep. There, all 4 Blackwoods tangled together on the study sofa, united in both loss and newfound connection. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the fresh snow glittering under a brilliant blue sky. After a quick breakfast, they bundled into warm coats and made the journey to Brookside Cemetery. Richard had arranged for a private visit, ensuring they wouldn't be disturbed. The girls approached Elizabeth's grave with solemnity, each carrying a small gift they had selected themselves, Madison with a handmade card, Mackenzie with a Christmas ornament, Morgan with a photograph of all 3 of them with Richard. Hi, Mom, Madison began, her breath visible in the cold air. We found Dad, just like you wanted us to. He's not perfect, Mackenzie added, in what Richard recognized as high praise from her. But he tries really hard. Morgan placed her photograph carefully against the headstone. We're okay, she said softly. You don't have to worry anymore. Richard hung back, giving them this moment together until Madison beckoned him forward. Dad has something to say too. Put on the spot, Richard knelt in the snow beside his daughters. I'm taking care of our girls, Liz, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I'm learning to be the father they deserve, the husband I should have been. They remained at the grave for nearly an hour, the girls alternately solemn and animated as they shared stories about their lives with their mother. Richard marveled at their resilience, their capacity to experience grief without being consumed by it. As they prepared to leave, Morgan surprised everyone by singing a soft lullaby, one Elizabeth had apparently sung to them as infants, preserved in Morgan's remarkable memory. Her sweet voice carried in the still cemetery air, a bridge between past and present. Back at the mansion, the day unfolded in a blur of torn wrapping paper, delighted exclamations, and the controlled chaos of family celebration. Richard had chosen gifts with careful consideration. Not extravagant displays of wealth, but thoughtful items that acknowledged each girl's emerging personality, art supplies for Madison's creative spirit, a telescope for Mackenzie's curious mind, first edition books for Morgan's love of stories. The greatest gift, however, came after dinner, when Richard presented each girl with a locket containing a tiny photograph of Elizabeth. So she's always with you, he explained as he helped them with the clasps, no matter where you go. Madison immediately declared she would never take hers off. Mackenzie examined the craftsmanship with approval before slipping it around her neck. Morgan held hers to her heart for a long moment before putting it on, her expression thoughtful. Later, as the excitement of the day began to wane, Richard found Morgan sitting alone in the window seat of her room, watching the snow fall. Everything. Okay, he asked, sitting beside her. She nodded, her fingers toying with the locket. I was just thinking about what happens next. What do you mean? Morgan turned her perceptive gaze to him. Miss Parker said we might get to stay forever. Is that true? If that's what you want, Richard confirmed. Her final report is due after the new year. What if she says no? The question revealed the uncertainty that still lingered beneath their growing comfort with each other. Richard chose his words carefully. Then we fight. Together. I won't. Give up on us being a family, Morgan. She considered this, then asked, what about when we're older? Will you still want us when we're teenagers and get into trouble? Richard smiled at her foresight. Especially then. Being a family isn't just for the easy parts. Morgan leaned against him slightly. Mom's last letter said she hoped you'd find us someday. She said you might need us as much as we needed you. The insight struck Richard deeply. Elizabeth had understood, something he was only beginning to grasp, that in saving these girls he was saving himself too. She was right, he admitted. I did need you. I just didn't know it yet. As the evening settled into peaceful quiet, with the Christmas tree lights casting a warm glow through the mansion, Richard reflected on the journey of the past 4 months. The girls had brought chaos and complications, yes, but also purpose and presence, and a kind of joy he'd forgotten was possible. Miss Parker's words echoed in his mind. Grief work is family work. Perhaps that was the gift Elizabeth had left them all, the chance to heal together, to build something new from the fragments of what had been lost. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Boston in a clean, blank canvas. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. School would resume, work would call. The everyday complexities of raising 3 unique personalities would test his patience and resolve. But tonight, in this moment of perfect stillness, Richard Blackwood knew with certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Spring arrived in Boston with typical New England reluctance. Tentative sunshine followed by sudden snowfall, then unseasonable warmth that coaxed crocuses from the mansion's gardens, before frost returned to challenge their optimism. Inside the Blackwood home, a similar pattern of progress and setbacks marked the family's journey toward permanence. January had brought Miss Parker's final recommendation, permanent custody for Richard, with continued monitoring for another 6 months. The news had been celebrated with ice cream for dinner, a suggestion from Madison that Richard would have dismissed as absurd a year earlier, but now embraced as an appropriately joyful response. February saw the official announcement of Richard's transition to chairman, while Marcus Fletcher assumed the CEO role. The business press speculated endlessly about the reasons behind the change, but Richard maintained his privacy, offering only that personal priorities had guided his decision. March brought parent-teacher conferences at Cambridge Academy, where Richard learned that Morgan was reading 3 grade levels above her peers. Mackenzie showed remarkable aptitude for science, but struggled with authority figures, and Madison had a gift for bringing other children together, but often neglected her own needs to keep peace. They're thriving academically, their homeroom teacher, Ms. Winters, assured him, but more importantly, they're beginning to trust that stability is possible. That's significant progress for children who've experienced so much disruption. Now as April dawned, Richard found himself preparing for another milestone, the girls' 9th birthday. Their actual birth date had passed quietly the previous year, as they were between foster placements. This would be their first real celebration, and Richard was determined to make it memorable without overwhelming them. Nothing extravagant, he reminded himself as he reviewed the plans with Mrs. Reynolds. Meaningful, not excessive. His assistant at Blackwood Enterprises, Sarah Chen, had helped arrange a small gathering at the Boston Children's Museum, privatized for the evening to avoid unwanted attention. The guest list included a few carefully selected classmates, Dr. Abrams from the school counseling office, Alan and his wife, and even Miss Parker, whose stern exterior had softened incrementally with each monitoring visit. The preparations were nearly complete when Richard received an unexpected call from Diana Reeves, the investigator, who had initially confirmed the girl's identity. "I've been going through some archived material from Hope Haven," she explained. "They're relocating to a new facility and found additional records from Elizabeth's stay. There are some items I think you and the girls should have." Richard arranged to meet her that afternoon, driving to her downtown office while the girls were at their weekly art therapy session. Diana greeted him with professional warmth, gesturing to a cardboard box on her desk. "The shelter keeps personal effects for former residents for a minimum of 5 years," she explained. "Elizabeth's things were catalogued but never claimed. When I mentioned my connection to the case during their inventory process, the director asked if I could facilitate their return to her family." Richard approached the box cautiously, as if it might contain something volatile. In many ways it did, tangible pieces of Elizabeth's final months, preserved exactly as she had left them. Diana stepped out to give him privacy as he carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay items both mundane and precious, a worn paperback novel with a bookmarker still in place, a blue cardigan he remembered buying for her birthday years earlier, a small collection of seashells gathered from their honeymoon beach in Maine, a handwritten recipe for gingerbread that had been her grandmother's. Beneath these he found a manila envelope labeled, "For the girls someday." With trembling hands, Richard opened it to discover 3 identical silver bracelets, each engraved with one of the girls' names, and a single word, "Beloved." A note accompanied them in Elizabeth's flowing handwriting. "For my daughters on their 16th birthday, may these remind you that you were wanted, cherished, and loved from your very first heartbeat. Whatever path your lives take, know that you carry my heart with you, always, Mom." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of Elizabeth's love for their daughters and the magnitude of what they had lost washing over him anew. She had planned for their futures even while uncertain of her own, creating touchstones of connection they would someday treasure. Deeper in the box he discovered something unexpected, a sealed envelope addressed to him. For a moment he couldn't bring himself to open it, afraid of what final words Elizabeth might have written to the husband who had failed her so completely. Finally, with Diana still respectfully absent, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Inside: "Richard, if you're reading this, it means our daughters found you, as I've been teaching them to do through stories and photographs. It means I'm no longer there to mediate that meeting, to explain the complexities of who we were together and apart. I don't know what man you will be when they find you. I hope he is someone who can see beyond spreadsheets and acquisitions, who can recognize the miracle these girls represent. They are the best of us both. Your determination, my empathy, your intelligence, my creativity. They deserve a father who will cherish these qualities, not try to reshape them into something more conventionally successful. I've never stopped loving the man I married, though I've often struggled to find him beneath the ambition that consumed him. Perhaps our daughters will succeed where I failed. Perhaps they will remind you of what truly matters. I'm not angry anymore. I understand now that we simply wanted different things. You wanted to build an empire. I wanted to build a family. In the end, I got my wish in these 3 remarkable girls. I hope someday you'll recognize that they are worth more than any company. Valuation or market share. Take care of our daughters, Richard. And perhaps in doing so, you might rediscover the man I fell in love with, the one who noticed constellations and brought me wildflowers on ordinary Tuesdays. With hope for the future, Elizabeth. Richard folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket close to his heart. Elizabeth's final message contained no bitterness, no recriminations, only hope that he might become the father their daughters deserved, that he might find his way back to the man he had once been. She still believed in me, he murmured to the empty room, even at the end. When he collected the girls from therapy later that afternoon, Richard found himself studying them with renewed perspective, seeing more clearly the blend of himself and Elizabeth that created 3 entirely unique individuals. Morgan's thoughtful observation, Madison's intuitive empathy, Mackenzie's fierce determination, each carried parts of both parents, yet was wholly herself. "What's in the box?" Mackenzie asked immediately, spotting the cardboard container on the front seat. "Some things that belong to your mother," Richard answered honestly. "Special things she left for you." That evening they gathered in the living room as Richard carefully unpacked Elizabeth's possessions. The girls handled each item with reverent curiosity, examining the worn pages of her novel, holding the blue cardigan to their faces to see if any trace of her scent remained, arranging the seashells in patterns on the coffee table. Richard had decided to save the bracelets for their actual birthday, respecting Elizabeth's wish that they receive them when they were older, but choosing 9 rather than 16 as the milestone. The letter, however, he kept private, a communication between husband and wife that belonged to their history alone. "She collected shells from everywhere she went," Morgan said, studying the delicate spiral of a whelk. "She told us there was a whole box of them from all her trips. These are from our honeymoon," Richard explained. "We spent a week on the Maine coast in a little cottage right on the water. She would get up at sunrise every morning to search for new treasures while the tide was out." "Did you look for shells too?" Madison asked. Richard smiled at the memory. "I did, but I was terrible at it, always picking up broken pieces while she found perfect specimens. She said I was too focused on the big picture to notice the small. Treasures right at my feet." The metaphor wasn't lost on him now, though it had been then. "Can we go there someday?" Morgan asked. "To the beach where you found these?" "Of course," Richard promised. "Perhaps this summer." As the girls carefully returned the shells to their box, Richard noticed Mackenzie holding back, unusually quiet. Later, after Madison and Morgan had gone upstairs to get ready for bed, he found Mackenzie sitting alone on the back porch, staring into the garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to emerge. "Everything okay?" he asked, settling beside her on the step. She shrugged, picking at a thread on her jeans. "Seeing Mum's stuff makes her feel real again. Sometimes I forget what she was like." "That's natural," Richard assured her. "You were very young. Do you think she'd be mad that we're happy now? Without her?" The question revealed the complex guilt that often accompanies grief, the feeling that moving forward somehow betrays the person lost. Richard chose his words carefully. "Your mother wanted nothing more than for you to be happy. The last thing she wrote to me was her hope that we would all find each other, that we would become a family." Mackenzie considered. "This, so she'd be okay with us calling this home, with us calling you Dad?" "She'd be more than okay," Richard answered, his throat tight with emotion. "She'd be overjoyed." Mackenzie leaned against him slightly, a gesture of trust that had once been rare but was becoming more frequent. "I was mad at you for a long time, for not finding us sooner." "That's understandable," Richard acknowledged. "I'm not mad anymore," she continued. "Mum's letters said you didn't know about us, that you might have made different choices if you had." "I would have," Richard confirmed, the certainty absolute. "Everything would have been different." Mackenzie nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then, we're good." The simplicity of her forgiveness, hard-won and honest, moved him deeply. The days leading up to the birthday celebration passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Richard found himself enjoying the planning process, almost as much as the girls were enjoying the prospect of their first real party. Even Mackenzie, typically suspicious of excessive displays, couldn't hide her excitement when Richard confirmed that the planetarium portion of the museum would be part of their private event. "Mom always said we were born under a lucky star," she explained when Richard expressed surprise at her enthusiasm for astronomy. "I want to see if I can find it." On the morning of their birthday, Richard woke early to prepare a special breakfast. Chocolate chip pancakes shaped, somewhat clumsily, like the number 9, fresh strawberries, and hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. As he arranged everything, on a tray Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the kitchen doorway. "They're already awake," she informed him with a smile, whispering and giggling in Madison's room for the past half hour. Richard found all 3 girls huddled on Madison's bed, still, in their pajamas, looking through the photo album they had been creating together, a chronological history of their short but eventful lives, with Elizabeth's pregnancy photos at the beginning and recent family snapshots filling the later pages. "Happy birthday," he announced from the doorway, balancing the breakfast tray. Their delight at the simple gesture, pancakes for breakfast, a tradition in many families but a novelty in theirs, reinforced what Richard had been learning over the past months. That presence mattered more than extravagance, that thoughtfulness outweighed expense. After breakfast, he presented them with their first gifts, 3 small boxes wrapped in silver paper. Inside each was one of Elizabeth's bracelets, the engraved names catching the morning light. "Your mother got these for you," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She wanted you to have them when you were older, but I thought today was the perfect time." The girls examined the delicate silver bands with wonder, running their fingers over their engraved names and the word "beloved" that accompanied each. "She knew we'd be together someday," Madison said softly. "All of us." Richard helped each girl fasten her bracelet, noting how the silver seemed to capture Elizabeth's essence somehow, elegant but substantial, beautiful but meaningful. The museum celebration that evening was everything Richard had hoped, joyful without being overwhelming, special without being ostentatious. The girls moved through the exhibits with their friends, alternating between childish exuberance and moments of surprising maturity as they played host to their guests. In the planetarium, as stars wheeled overhead in magnificent projection, Richard found himself seated between Morgan and Mackenzie, with Madison sprawled across all their laps in complete contentment. "Are you looking for your lucky star?" he whispered to Mackenzie as the narrator identified. "Constellations." She nodded, her face illuminated by the artificial starlight. "Mum said it was in Cassiopeia. That's why our middle names all start with C." Richard hadn't made this connection before. Madison Claire, Mackenzie Catherine, and Morgan Celeste. Elizabeth had woven astronomy into their very identities. "There," Morgan pointed suddenly, as the distinctive W shape of Cassiopeia appeared overhead. "That's where we're from." The simple statement contained a universe of meaning, acknowledgement of their origin, their connection to Elizabeth, their place in a continuing story. Richard felt the weight and wonder of it as they sat together. Beneath the artificial sky, a family constellation formed against all odds. Later, after the party had ended and they had returned home pleasantly exhausted, Richard tucked each girl into her own bed, a ritual that had evolved from awkward necessity to cherished routine over the months. "Did you have a good birthday?" he asked Morgan, the last to be tucked in. She nodded, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "The best one." Even though, Richard stopped himself, But Morgan understood the unfinished question. "Mom was there," she said, with the simple certainty of childhood. "In our bracelets, in the stars, in us." The wisdom in her words struck Richard deeply. Elizabeth was indeed present in every aspect of their daughters, in Madison's infectious laugh, in Mackenzie's determined spirit, in Morgan's perceptive gaze. In loving them, he was honoring her as well. The following morning brought the final piece of their journey toward permanence, the court date for legal adoption. Though Richard was already their biological father, the formal adoption would erase the years of foster care from their legal status, cementing their place as his acknowledged heirs and, more importantly, his family. The courtroom was smaller than Richard had expected, the proceedings less formal but somehow more meaningful for their simplicity. Judge Eleanor Winters, a veteran of family court with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, reviewed their case thoroughly before addressing the girls directly. "I understand this has been quite a journey for you three," she said, setting aside her papers to focus entirely on the triplets. "Finding your father, building a new home, how do you feel about making it permanent?" Madison, naturally the spokesperson, answered first. "We belong together, we always have." Mackenzie nodded in agreement. "He's not perfect, but he's ours." Morgan, typically the quietest, surprised everyone by adding, "And we're his, that's what family means." Judge Winters smiled, clearly moved by their simple eloquence. Mr. Blackwood, raising 3 children, especially 3 who have experienced significant upheaval, is no small undertaking. Are you prepared for the challenges ahead? Richard looked at his daughters, 3 pairs of eyes so like Elizabeth's, watching him with trust that had been hard-won and would always be precious. They've taught me more about courage and resilience in these months than I learned in 40 years of business, he answered honestly. I can't imagine my life without them now. The judge nodded, satisfied. Then, by the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I confirm the adoption of Madison Claire Mackenzie Catherine and Morgan Celeste Blackwood. Congratulations, family. The formality of the pronouncement belied the profound shift it represented, legal recognition of a bond that had been forming since that first meeting in the cemetery nearly a year before. Outside the courthouse, standing in the April sunshine, Richard knelt to the girls' level. What would you like to do to celebrate? They exchanged their silent triplet communication before Madison answered. Can we go to the beach, the one where you and Mom found the shells? It's not warm enough for swimming, Richard warned. We don't need to swim, Morgan explained. We just want to see it, to collect our own shells. The drive to Maine took just over 2 hours, the girls alternating between excited chatter and comfortable silence as the city gave way to countryside and finally to coastline. The small cottage where Richard and Elizabeth had honeymooned was now a vacation rental, closed for the off-season but visible from the public beach access point. That's where we stayed, Richard pointed out as they made their way down to the shore. Your mother used to sit on that porch every evening to watch the sunset. The beach was deserted, the April air still carrying winter's chill despite the bright sunshine. The girls didn't seem to mind, immediately spreading out to begin their shell hunt with the serious focus of collectors. Richard watched them move along the tide line, Madison methodical in her search pattern, Mackenzie scrambling over rocks to reach less accessible areas, Morgan examining each find, with careful deliberation before either keeping or discarding it. 3 distinct approaches, 3 unique personalities, bound by invisible threads of shared history and DNA. His daughters, Elizabeth's daughters, theirs. He bent to pick up a small, perfect scallop shell, remembering how Elizabeth had taught him to look more closely at the beach's offerings. The broken ones have their own beauty, she had insisted. You just have to be willing to see it. He hadn't understood then. He did now. Morgan approached, her collection cupped carefully in both hands. Look what I found, she said, opening. Her palms to reveal not shells, but 3 smooth pieces of sea glass, 1 blue, 1 green, 1 amber. 1 for each of us, Richard observed. Morgan nodded. They're different colors, but they were all made by the same ocean. The metaphor wasn't lost on Richard. Different yet fundamentally connected, like the three girls who shared a birthday and a history, but were developing into distinct individuals. They stayed until sunset, building a small driftwood fire on the beach to ward off the evening chill. As the sky painted itself in spectacular shades of pink and gold, Richard found himself thinking of Elizabeth, her laughter on this same shore, her delight in simple pleasures, her capacity for joy that he had forgotten in his pursuit of success, but was rediscovering through their daughters. "Do you think she knows we're here?" Madison asked suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "I do," Richard answered without hesitation. "I think she knows everything important about your lives." "Even though she's not really here," Mackenzie pressed, her practical nature seeking concrete answers to abstract questions. Richard considered this carefully. "She's here in the ways that matter most, in our memories, in the love we share, in each of you." Morgan, who had been watching the horizon intently, pointed as the first star appeared in the deepening blue. "There," she said softly, "our lucky star." Whether it was actually in Cassiopeia or not seemed irrelevant as they sat together on the cooling sand, a family bound not just by law or biology, but by choice, the daily choice to love, to forgive, to begin again. Later, driving back to Boston with three sleeping girls in the back seat, their laps full of beach treasures, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From solitary businessman to father of triplets, from a life measured in acquisitions to one measured in moments. From emptiness to fullness. Elizabeth's final letter remained close to his heart, her hope that he might rediscover the man he had been before ambition consumed him. Looking in the rearview mirror at his sleeping daughters, Richard realized he had found something better. Not the man he had been, but the father he was becoming. Not the life he had planned, but the one he had been given. As the Boston skyline appeared in the distance, its lights twinkling against the night sky like earthbound stars, Richard made a silent promise to Elizabeth, to his daughters, to himself, to remain present in every moment, to prioritize love over achievement, to build a family stronger than any empire. The mansion on Beacon Hill awaited them, no longer a showcase of success, but a home filled with evidence of life being fully lived. Drawings on the refrigerator, bicycles in the hallway, laughter in rooms that had known only silence. Richard carried each sleeping girl to her bed, careful not to wake them. As he tucked the blanket